Anand, it's great to see you as always. We've known each other a long time. On this episode, you're going to persuade me that persuasion is what's lacking in our society. How are things with you?
Great. It's so good to talk to you. This is a rare case where you're both the interviewer about the book, but you are also in the book. I don't know if that's kind of one of the conflicts of interest that you normally are breaking wide open, but here you
Yes.
are. We're just inhabiting that conflict of interest right
Yes,
now.
I am quoted in this book about persuasion. We'll get to that in a second. Let's start with the top line here. The book is called The Persuaders at the Front Lines of the Fights for Hearts, Minds, and Democracy. One of the arguments baked into this book is the idea that persuasion is a critical thing in a democracy, that democracy is predicated on changing minds. There's that old idea that democracy is, or politics in a democracy is war by other means. And the war, therefore, in part, one of the weapons is persuasion. And you argue that our culture kind of is lacking valuing persuasion anymore. Tell us a little bit more about that thesis, where you came to it from, how you came up with this notion that we're lacking respect for the idea of persuasion in our politics and our democracy.
I think if you step back and you say, for all of human history, there's been roughly two big theories about how we should make decisions about the future, right? Because shit comes up in any community that we got to make a group decision, right? Do those people get let into the village or not? Is this ceremony allowed or not? Should we drain the lake when the winter comes or not? And for almost all of human history, except for the quirk of the last few hundred years, it was felt, I think by a very large number of people, that it was best to let one guy in the community just decide those things for everybody. Too complicated to get everybody involved, to get even 10 people involved. And so for most of human history, we've been ruled by just like the one guy, almost always an actual guy. And in the last few hundred years, a quite radical alternative arose, the one that has given you your kind of purpose and vocation, which is the idea that we should actually all make these decisions about the future together, that we should have a rollicking, roiling, perpetual 24/7 conversation about everything at all times. And through this conversation, through this argument, through acts of expressing preferences in voting, but not only that, canvassing, voting with our feet in any number of ways, make these decisions about the future, choose the future, make the future through this kind of act of mass dysfunctional, beautiful group conversation. And I start that way to say, this is a very small period of history where this has been the dominant view of how things should be done. It's had a really good run. And this idea is probably as imperiled and as under real questioning as it's certainly been in your and my lifetime, partly because of all the anti-democratic stuff, again, happening in other countries too. It's not all just because the Electoral College and the Koch brothers. It's happening in Brazil. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in India, certainly one of the big losses. And I think the rise of China is an interesting phenomenon, a real counterexample of a country that has stuck to autocracy and been incredibly successful by certain measures. And so we're in this moment where the dominant idea of the last 300 years, which is that we choose the future. We should choose the future by talking to each other and figuring it out and attempting to change each other's minds in order to change things. That idea is up for grabs and in play in a way that I don't know that I ever expected in my lifetime. And so to me, persuasion is at the very core of that whole idea. Because if in a certain year, gay people cannot get married, and it is a live question facing this community as more and more people come out as gay, that we need to decide whether we're locking more and more of these gay people out of this institution or change our definition of marriage. If the idea of you and I talking that through and figuring out what are your values, what does your religion really allow if you think about it more deeply, what is my fear behind this thing really about, Why is it that gay people want to be part of this institution? If we can't have those conversations, what we're actually doing is opening the door for how things used to be a really long time ago, which is, okay, let's sort this out through violence, or let's sort this out by having one guy decide everything. And in a moment where we literally have the rising autocracy and rising political violence, I think it is very much related to this loss of faith in persuasion. And this loss of faith shows up in all kinds of ways. It shows up in benign forms and in malignant forms. I think it shows up in a kind of fatalism that a lot of us have, that I certainly feel about those anti-vaxxers. What are we going to, come on, they're never going to come around. Those Trump people, I mean, if you voted for him once, you voted for him twice, clearly racism is something thrilling for you, so on and so forth, all the way to the kind of very toxic forms where we're not persuading because we want to just overturn election results. And we think that's much easier than actually winning an argument. But in a whole bunch of ways, I think our culture has turned against the idea that it is possible to change people's minds. And that is both an empirically false statement, as you know, as someone who's worked in politics and saw arguments make a difference. How you frame a candidate makes a difference. Speeches, as you know very well, make a difference. A movement that in the United States of America, Bernie Sanders' movement, would have been laughed out of town a few years before it won nearly half the states in this country, right? We see it works. We see Donald Trump won the first time and did not win the second time. And the country's, quite different because of that shift in minds that a lot of people had, millions of people had. And so I became interested in people who were resisting this kind of great write-off that I saw around me, a write-off that I participate in myself, whether I'm proud of it or not. Organizers in particular. This is in some ways a book about like the Tao of organizing, about the soul of organizing. And I think what a lot of the organizers and others that I spent time with, what they bring to the table is a deep moral commitment on some of these issues, a deep desire to change the society in very fundamental transformational ways, a real moral commitment to having a society that works for everybody. And yet, what I think most of them that I wrote about in The Persuaders share in common that is different from the rest of us is they fundamentally believe it's possible to persuade. They have ideas about how to do so. They're doing it on the ground every day, and they refuse to give up on people. That doesn't mean they think everybody's in play. It doesn't mean they're trying to go talk to, fascists who are like shooting beer bottles in their backyard for practice. But it means that they view a significant number of Americans as being in, frankly, a perpetual state of moral contradiction, of not being entirely clear about how to make sense of the world. And they view their role as organizers as not just to provoke, not just to offer a policy agenda, but to walk with millions of people, one way or another, in the process of forming a consciousness that will lead to the kind of world they want. And I became very interested in their project and tried to write about it so that we could all learn how to be maybe a little bit more like them.
What they're doing comes out of what is called, and certainly used to be called to a greater degree, political education in the labor movement, right? The kind of old school labor movement had a piece of it that was about political education, which is, it's about educating people on what's actually going on in the world so that they can arrive at a political analysis. I want to push back, though, on one thing baked into this thesis, which is the idea that we're hostile to, or that we can't be persuaded, or that that's under attack. I often think about the organizer, having done campaigns, having done those kinds of things in my life, where you tell the story of people knocking on the door, this kind of idea of what, as it's called, deep canvassing. You knock on the door. You're not just there to say, will you vote for this or that candidate, but to actually just hear people talk about where they are politically or on different issues or whatever. And that can be a persuasive moment. That can be a more persuasive way to change communities, people's thinking. But here's where what I worry about is that the minute that door closes, there is a 24/7 persuasion machine being pumped into that house through cable television, through social media. And so it's not that people can't be persuaded. It's not that even regular rank and file folks are against the idea of being persuaded. It's that there's a persuasion machine connected to them through their phone and through their television 24 hours a day. So I think the more micro question is, it's not can people be persuaded, it's how do you persuade people to even realize that they're being perpetually persuaded and frankly manipulated by the most powerful people through that machine, which they may not consider, sort of be conscious of on a moment-to-moment basis, is something that's trying to manipulate and persuade them.
This is why I love talking to you. This is the core question that's at the heart of the book. And I think you are exactly right. I saw that when I went to Arizona to actually witness people doing this deep canvassing. One of the guys in particular was just a awful, beautiful example of this, because his consciousness was like, imagine if you printed out 24 hours of Fox News transcripts, and then you took scissors and you just cut different strips of ribbons of the words, and then you just threw them around a room and then picked them back up and assembled them in a different order, and then just had someone read them. That's how that man talked, right? You are absolutely right. But to me, David, that is not a reason for us to be fatalistic about that kind of work of persuasion. That is the reason we need to get involved in persuasion and compete with that. Because right now, you are absolutely right now, and I want to go deep on this because I think this is a really crucial point. The word that I would use here is meaning making, and a lot of organizers use this word meaning making. What the apparatus inside the house and on the phone is doing, the right's extended media apparatus, is what I would call meaning making. A very concerted, quite intelligent, shrewd process of meaning making, which is different from I give you the news, right? People think of MSNBC as, people casually will say it's the left's Fox. It's not in a whole bunch of ways, right? And I work with MSNBC. It's not, and it's not for a whole bunch of reasons. The most important reason it's not is MSNBC is covering, the thing driving each block is a thing that happened in Washington or is happening in Washington, right? And it's not starting with you and your life and what you're feeling, right? It's starting with this bill is advancing, or this investigation's going on, or this committee is doing this, right? And then it's explaining it to you, and I mean, your site, very different from MSNBC, but broadly, in the tradition of media, you in the same way, you start with what's the development? What's the thing that's happening? If I step back and think about what Fox is really doing, or what a lot of these sites, particularly the more out there ones, are really doing, they're not doing that, but for the right. They're starting in a different place. It's kind of like user-centered media, right? They're starting with, what are you feeling? What are you afraid of? What are your anxieties? Your kid came home and said, what about America and slavery? You have to do what kind of training at work now? What? 5% of your time at work? And you're not being paid for those trainings? You got to go to these trainings? And they say, what about people at those trainings? Right? Wait, people in our community now are called Latinx. They're not called Latino or Latina anymore. Wait, what? Right? These things, it's kind of interesting. In my town, I used to be able to speak in English to all the cashiers at the Walgreens. I can't anymore. These are the just regular experiences that regular people have all the time. They're pre-political experiences, you could say, right? They're just your kid says a thing. You notice something at Walgreens, just pre-political. What Fox and the whole right-wing ecosystem do brilliantly is start from those anxieties you're having. I don't know what research they do. I would love to know more about that. Maybe they get it. They start from that, right? And then they got this truck of wares that they want to deliver to you. But they're not starting, I think as folks on the left do, with here's the truck of wares and why it's really, really important that you buy these wares. It's oh yeah, you don't like these trainings, huh? You're anxious that you don't like the Spanish speaking at the Walgreens, right? Oh, your kid said what, right? And then the whole content of the news is backing the truck of wares awkwardly into what's going on with you. It is based on, I say this as a writer who like writes about like what's going on in people in a deep level. Like it is very good psychological insight that whole project is based on. Really good understanding of people and their anxieties. You can say the anxieties are dumb, they're not dumb, they're righteous, they're not. I'm set that aside. People are just having these anxieties. People are seeing these stimuli, and people are just confused by life. People are confused by every new thing that has ever happened in front of them, right? And the whole right-wing apparatus, the thing you are absolutely correctly describing as in the phone, on the TV, when that door closes, is not just, it's not just that it has more time with that guy than the canvassers do. It's that it is like hooking itself on to the psychological experience of being a person in 2022, a man who, like so many men in this country, knows, like, I can't be a man in the way my dad was a man. And like, my son is clearly able to like be a new kind of man in a way that I'm not like quite figuring out, like, who am I, right? How many men are feeling that? White people, like, what does it mean to be white now? Like, can I not say things? What is allyship? What, like, right? There's people on all kinds of levels of that, right? From being annoyed at the trainings to being like super woke, but just still like, what do I say? You know, manufacturing used to be a thing we do. Now we don't do it anymore because of permanent normal trade relations with China. Suddenly, the whole concept of like, what does shape of a life looks like? What kind of education you need? Just gone from that town in North Carolina, right? People are feeling these things, and the right is there for them. It is talking them through it. It is meaning making. It is explaining. It is connecting those feelings to the alien invasion on the border. It is connecting that to George Soros. It is connecting that to Black Lives Matter and critical race theory and Kimberly Crenshaw. Like, people don't go to Kimberly Crenshaw by themselves, you know?
Right. I mean, it is what it's doing is it's taking their anxieties, their state of mind, and connecting it, or persuading them to connect it, to use persuasion, persuading them to connect it to a specific political project.
Correct.
And so my point is, and I think we agree, is that it's not necessarily that there's a hostility to being persuaded. It's that the most powerful people in the world have access to and have developed a machine of persuasion that is all powerful. Now, I want to be clear. I agree with you that people, rank and file people who are hooked up to that machine, should not be written off. I mean, yes, like sort of hardcore fascists, sure. Like there are some folks who are down that rabbit hole. But I think back to and you write about this in the book, I think back to the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, where Bernie went on Fox News, did a Fox News town hall, and there was some consternation about that. He was previously asked, I'm just using these as examples. He was asked after the 2016 election, you know, do you think, it was some question along the lines of, do you think all Donald Trump voters are racist? And he said, you know, no, I don't think all Donald Trump voters are racist. And that was like a scandal. Like that was the idea. And I think that got to the crux of something that you're talking about, which is that there is this idea that we just write off. I mean, you write off 80 million voters as essentially all unpersuadable deplorables. That idea is so fixed in the culture that it was scandalous for Bernie to be like, no, I don't think all 80 million voters are unreachable. And so I do think this is on both sides, right? This kind of tribalism that you talk about. But I also want to take issue with another part of your book. And again, we're agreeing a lot here, but this part of your book also got to me. You wrote, many political campaigns seem to focus more on mobilizing sympathetic voters than on winning over skeptics. Leaders who attempt outreach to the unpersuaded are attacked by their own sides as sellouts. Now, listen, I remember Bernie being criticized for being on Fox News and the like. So I agree with you and I disagree. I agree with you that that if you write off whole swaths of the population, especially if you're in politics, you're basically, if in a certain sense, abandoning the small d democratic project. But I also do think politicians do use this idea of outreach to so-called moderate voters or swing voters as a way to justify actual selling out to their donors. So I guess my question on this is, how do we discern between a legitimate effort to persuade persuadable voters and what I would call an illegitimate effort, which was often used in the Obama years, to use this sort of Obama-ish unity rhetoric, you know, not blue states, not red states, that ends up being a veneer for a kind of donor class agenda? Like, how do we discern between the two?
That's such a good question. Something I thought about a lot. So let's do this using a specific example of a topic area of policy, healthcare, right? In many ways, and I recognize it's a subtle thing, so this may not be obvious. I'm glad we're teasing it out. What I am trying to argue for is literally the opposite of the thing you're worried about, right? I think what you're talking about is, in a way, what this whole book is up against, which is persuasion through dilution, which has been the dominant theory of the Democratic Party, right? You just persuade by just like take the original like philosophical nucleus of a thing and then just like add a ton of water and then you will reach people in the middle, right? And there's a whole bunch of reasons this is problematic, which we should kind of go through. Like, first of all, and this is an important moment in the book, like moderates are not people in the middle, right? And I really learned this from Anat Osorio above all. Moderates are people who have not yet committed to one dominant moral frame, right? Like, you're not a moderate just because you want really progressive things, David. You're not a moderate. The real sense in which you are not a moderate is your worldview is very baked through a lot of reading, experience, whatever, right? If anyone who has ever spent any time talking to voters knows that thankfully most people in this country are not like you and me. You know, like most people are just like living their lives, doing normal things, like taking care of their kids, right? And so it is very normal to have conversations with voters in which they're like, I hate socialism, but I believe, you know, I had this so much when I was covering the Bernie campaign, right? Like, I hate socialism, but Bernie really seems like he's a, you know, he just seems to fight for.
Yeah, I mean, this is right. It's like
get
get the government hands off my Medicare. That's what that is.
All of it, right?
Yeah.
And so the dominant story of the Democratic Party is persuasion through dilution. So let's take healthcare. Like, let's start with like the lodestar idea. I think someone like Obama would agree that like the core philosophical nucleus of like what he's pursuing is like everyone having healthcare, right? And then you water in the hope of reaching people, and you get private insurance as the lead, not, of course, universal. I mean, all the things you know, right? And the hope is you'll get Max Baucus and you'll get this and you get maybe some Republicans and, you know, you'll clone Romney's ideas and maybe all of that, right? That has been the dominant frame. What The Persuaders is interested in as a book is people who have actually an opposite theory, which is persuasion through standing very firmly in conviction of a more demanding set of ideas, and outreach that is rooted in the power of that standing firm in conviction, right? So again, to stick with healthcare and make that transparent, it was actually the opposite of what I just described with Obamacare. It is advocating for something like Medicare for all and sticking to that. And then saying, and I think this is where progressives have some answering to do in terms of the selling of stuff like this. I think there are ways to talk about Medicare for all or some equivalent thing that are frankly way more outreachy in their approach, right? So this is not outreach through not doing Medicare for all. It's outreach through, like, first of all, I would call it freedom care. I don't know why it's not called freedom care. Like, have you met America? Like, you know what I mean? Like, let's like work with what we've got here, people, right? Like, I listened to so many Bernie speeches about it that I admired. I listened to Elizabeth Warren speeches about it. I listened to AOC speeches about it. Eloquent, powerful. Bernie, like, healthcare is a human right. Here's the problem, right? I don't know if you wrote those speeches. Like, the problem is the people who don't like universal healthcare also don't like human right. You know what I mean?
No, listen, you're speaking my language. I mean, I'll cut to the chase here. Like, listen, there were some of us in the campaign who were saying part of the message needed to be, and I don't just mean this for the campaign, I think for the whole Medicare for all movement, because we're talking specifics here. Let's talk about how that unshackles you from your job.
Correct.
Let's talk about how that unshackles small business, even big business, from the rapacious health insurance industry and its bureaucracy and paperwork and horribleness, right? Like, that's a part of the message that you're not backing away from. You're not watering down the Medicare for all message. You are expanding the imagination about what it would actually do. And that is,
Correct.
I think, a very, very, very persuasive argument. So I think you're making a really, really good point here that persuasion doesn't mean water down, water down, water down into nothing. It means think about how to have your argument meet people where they are rather than necessarily where you want them to be. And that goes back, frankly, all the way to Saul Alinsky. I mean, that was Saul Alinsky's whole thing. You got to meet people where they are, not where you want them to be.
To stick with this example, I mean, I think sometimes this is a huge overgeneralization, but I think it has truth in it. If you think about the left very broadly defined, moderates, progressives, liberals, like whoever's in that enormous bucket that votes for Democrats most of the time. In some ways, we have a little bit ass backwards right now, which is the things we do end up being diluted, but the way we read to a lot of Americans is like as extremist, right? And I kind of think we need to flip that around. I think we need the demands to be more radical and the appearance and imagery to be more moderate, right? And I don't think that's fraudulent. Like, I actually think Medicare for All would, practically speaking, be the single greatest expansion in the lived experience of liberty in this country in a long time, right? And, and I think there's a whole missing language. It's freedom, right? It's also like healthcare is like, those kind of bills are just like the biggest stressor in marriages. Let's talk to people about their marriages. Like, do you want to have a more joyous marriage? There's a whole level at which we're not communicating with people about what this stuff is. So I'm really glad you asked that, because I think in a way and you look at who I interviewed, right? This is not a book with like Larry Summers as a character,
Right.
This is a book about very committed progressives, radicals in many cases, people who I think are as credible in their worlds as being like, pretty clear stick in the muds for a set of ideals, not compromisers. What they are all interested in, that I think not enough of us are interested in, is why aren't these ideas like bigger, and why aren't they reading to more people as their ideas, as their intuitions manifested into policy? And so I think the alternative to persuasion through dilution is persuasion that is grounded in deep conviction and oriented towards moral outreach, psychological outreach, emotional outreach.